Welcome back to the Perfectly Homeless podcast. We're still into the State Homeless Score project. Let's get back into it.
Yeah, let's do it.
So imagine you've just moved to a new state, right? You're there for this grueling 40-hour-a-week job at a booming agricultural plant. You've got a steady paycheck, you're putting in the work, but
But when your shift ends tonight, you'll be sleeping in a tent.
exactly, in freezing temperatures because there literally isn't a single apartment available. Today, for this deep dive, we're looking at how a person's experience of homelessness just drastically changes depending on which side of a state line they're standing on.
Right.
We're building a real-time scorecard for Nebraska, and this score is going to evolve dynamically throughout our conversation as we uncover the different facets of the state's system.
And, to really understand what's happening in Nebraska, you kind of have to completely reset your expectations of what homelessness actually looks like.
Yeah, it's not what you'd think.
No, not at all. We aren't just talking about major metropolitan areas. I mean, yes, the Omaha Council Bluffs area has an unhoused population of about 1,669 individuals.
Which is a lot.
It is. That's roughly 164 people per 100,000, which actually places them 21st among the top 60 metros in the country. And in Lincoln, a point-in-time count from January 2025 found 524 people unhoused on a single night.
Wow.
But the hidden store here, like the one that truly defines the state, is hidden in its geography.
Right, because this isn't just an urban issue, which is what we see in a lot of coastal cities. Nebraska has these highly specific rural niches that are frankly driving these numbers in ways you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Exactly. The state has this massive reliance on migrant agricultural workers. We're talking about people moving to places like Scottsbluff to harvest sugar beets or heading to the IBP meatpacking plant in Lexington.
And these are like vital labor-intensive industries for the state's economy. They need these workers.
They absolutely rely on them. But on top of that rural labor dynamic, you also have this direct spillover effect from the immense poverty on Native American reservations located right on the state's border.
Like Pine Ridge.
Pine Ridge, Rosebud, exactly.
Mhm.
Those crises heavily impact the northern Nebraska border towns.
So let's follow the actual path someone takes through this system, starting with, the very first domino to fall on our scorecard, which is housing affordability.
Right.
We mentioned Omaha was recently ranked the 9th hardest place to rent in the entire United States, which is just staggering. The demand is driving rents through the roof.
It's crazy.
It is. But when you look at those rural boom towns like Lexington and Scottsbluff, you literally have workers sleeping in their cars or pitching tents simply because the local housing market has zero affordable options.
It's a massive structural paradox. Like, the state and the agricultural sector are actively recruiting this massive low-wage workforce to keep the meatpacking and farming industries profitable.
Yeah.
But they're importing the labor without building the infrastructure to actually house them.
It sounds like an unwinnable game of musical chairs. Like you're adding thousands of new players to the game because you desperately need them to keep the music playing, but at the same time, you are actively removing the chairs.
That is exactly the mechanism at play. And, it's not just agricultural workers either. On the Pine Ridge Reservation, there's a 2,000 family wait list for housing.
2,000 families.
2,000 families. That level of systemic poverty pushes Native Americans into severely overcrowded substandard conditions.
Yeah.
I mean, we are talking about 16 people sharing a 3-bedroom house just to survive the winter.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And when even that becomes impossible, they cross the border into Nebraska towns like Chadron and just face outright homelessness.
So when a state's economy recruits labor without ensuring housing, and massive systemic poverty spills over its borders with nowhere for people to go, this lowers the overall picture for Nebraska right out of the gate.
It absolutely does. And the logical consequence of those affordable housing shares running out is that people have to seek shelter. Which brings us to our second category, shelter access.
Right. And the state's shelter infrastructure is fundamentally struggling to adapt to who actually needs help right now. We see that really clearly in Lincoln.
Yeah, they recently identified a desperate need for 99 low-barrier and domestic violence shelter beds.
And what really jumped out at me in the data is that homelessness among older adults people, 55 and older, jumped 10% in just a short window.
That's a huge spike.
Right. You have an aging population on fixed incomes slamming into that brutal rental market we just talked about.
And when those older folks, or anyone really, looks for a shelter, the options are incredibly rigid. Like in Omaha, there's a severe lack of shelters equipped to accommodate couples or families.
Wait, really? So if you're married...
Think about the psychological toll of that. You've lost your home, you've lost your stability, And your spouse is your absolute last remaining support system, right?
Yeah, that's your rock.
Exactly. But the shelter system essentially looks at you and forces you to make an impossible choice. You either separate into a men's and a women's facility, completely abandoning each other in your darkest moment,
Yeah.
or you go sleep outside on the concrete in freezing temperatures just so you can stay together.
That is just a brutal, dehumanizing choice to force on someone. I can't even imagine. And what happens in those rural areas like Chadron, where all those families from the reservation are seeking help?
Well, the rural safety net is functionally a thread. Chadron is the closest Nebraska town to the Pine Ridge Reservation. Their shelter is a tiny 18-bed facility.
18 beds for that whole spillover.
Yes. Because of the sheer volume of needs spilling over from the reservation, Native Americans accounted for 68% of the bed nights at that shelter in a recent 5-month span.
Wow.
They're doing everything they can, but I mean, an 18-bed facility cannot handle a regional housing collapse.
It just can't. So when your system forces lifelong partners to split up just to survive the night, and your rural safety nets are that severely undersized for the crisis at hand, you have to admit this lowers the overall picture for the state.
Significantly.
Yeah.
Which means it's probably time to look at where we currently stand with the score.
Right, let's pull up our preliminary score overlay. We are looking at the draft score right now. Based on this severe housing crunch and the rigid, totally overwhelmed shelter system, Nebraska is currently sitting at a temporary D.
AD, yeah, that makes sense.
But I really want to emphasize to you listening, this is a draft score. This is not the final grade. How the state handles the next phases, specifically the criminalization of these individuals and the strength of their street-level services, could significantly shift this final result.
It could. Because think about it, if the shelters are full or you refuse to separate from your husband or wife, the next logical step for survival is living in your vehicle.
Which brings us to our third category, criminalization and enforcement.
Right. And in Nebraska, maintaining a vehicle as a shelter brings you directly into the crosshairs of local enforcement. Let's break down the mechanics of Omaha's nuisance unit laws, because they are intense.
Okay, lay it out for me.
If you are sleeping in your car on public property, that car legally has to be in running condition. It has to have current registration. You have to have paid the local city wheel tax.
Wait, what's a wheel tax?
It's an additional local vehicle registration fee on top of the state ones.
Oh, great, more fees.
Exactly. And here is the most punishing part. The vehicle must be moved at least 1 mile and parked a minimum of 3 car lengths away from its original spot every 48 hours.
Every 2 days. Imagine trying to hold down an exhausting job at a meatpacking plant while meticulously tracking your mileage and your parking coordinates every 48 hours just so the city doesn't take your home away.
It's a full-time job in itself. And in Lincoln, it gets even more complicated. They have this thing called the Nuisance Vehicle Ordinance. And what's fascinating about this law is its origin. It was actually originally passed to stop, like, Fast and Furious-style street racing on O Street.
Wait, so a law written to stop reckless teenagers racing cars is now being used against people sleeping in their minivans?
Yes. The way the ordinance is written allows the police to impound vehicles for 10 days on a second offense. If you really look at the mechanics of this, towing and impound policies basically act as a massive mechanism of wealth extraction against the most vulnerable people.
Walk me through exactly how that wealth extraction happens. Like, how does a parking violation essentially ruin someone's life?
It operates like an inescapable debt collection tool.
Mhm.
Let's say you miss moving your car that required 1 mile. You get a ticket. You can't pay it because you're broke. You get towed.
Right.
Now your car is in an impound lot, charging you $30 or more every single day. For a person experiencing vehicular homelessness, losing that car means losing your literal shelter. It means losing your ability to commute to that low-wage agricultural job we talked about, and it strips away your absolute last physical safety net.
And then what? The city just keeps the car.
The city extracts fines they will never collect, the car is eventually auctioned off, and the person is forced onto the concrete, at which point the city then has to pay for expensive emergency street outreach to try to keep them alive.
It destroys lives, and it doesn't solve anything. And you see the lived reality of this with people like Jonathan Martin in Omaha. He was forced to move his shopping cart from behind Petco simply because the police were called.
Yeah.
He wasn't committing a crime. He wasn't hurting anyone. He was just existing. When a system spends its resources displacing people and towing their only shelter rather than solving the root issue, this shifts the score, definitely downward.
It just creates an environment of constant fear and movement. And because people still have to park somewhere to sleep, they are driven entirely underground. Which brings us to category 4, Vehicle-dwelling friendliness.
Right. Driven away from public streets, people rely on an invisible network of safe parking. If you look at local Reddit threads where people crowdsource survival tips, you see this whole shadow geography.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, locals will tell you that the Ameristar Truckers Lot is generally a safe place to close your eyes. The Sap Bros truck stop out on 144th and I-80 is reliable. And they even have shower stalls you can rent, which is huge for someone trying to maintain hygiene for a job.
That dignity of a shower is massive.
Mm-hmm.
But, the big box stores are a total gamble. Walmart's used to be a reliable safe haven nationally, but now it is highly dependent on the individual store manager.
Yeah, it's so arbitrary.
It is. One shift manager might look the other way, and then 3 hours later, a new manager clocks in and threatens to have you towed.
I just have to push back on the fundamental logic of guarding public space like this. Why is a 9 by 18-foot piece of asphalt so fiercely protected?
Right.
For someone in this situation, their car is the absolute last fortress between them and the elements. Why is finding a safe place to park treated as a criminal nuisance rather than a desperate cry for help?
It's a profound misalignment of public priorities. But within that dark reality, there actually is incredible community resilience. Local nonprofits are stepping into the massive gap left by the government.
Give me an example.
Well, organizations like Chariots for Hope, they're out there providing transportation grants to help people in crisis pay those exact impound fees we just talked about. They even run a trauma-informed transit service called the Safe Route Program to actively remove these transportation barriers so people can keep their jobs and their cars.
That's incredible. Because of that community resilience, because of those nonprofits stepping up, and because of those safe haven truck stops that turn a blind eye and just let exhausted people rest, this raises the overall picture, giving the state a slight bump for its citizens stepping in where policy failed.
For sure. But inevitably, the math catches up, and many people do lose their vehicles.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the fifth category, outreach and social services, and the harshest reality of all the concrete.
Yeah. What happens when you are fully unsheltered in Nebraska? It becomes a matter of sheer survival against the elements. Let's look at the point-in-time count conducted on the Keystone Trail in Omaha in January 2025.
It's brutal.
You have outreach workers out there in a negative 30-degree wind chill. I mean, think about what negative 30 degrees actually feels like on human skin.
It's deadly.
It is. You have people like Melissa Neuenfeld from Heal Omaha out there in the dark, handing out Narcan, passing out hand warmers, literally shining flashlights in people's faces just to check them for frostbite.
The dedication of those street-level workers is nothing short of heroic. I mean, they are the only thing keeping people alive out there. But they are operating within a bureaucratic system that is entirely overwhelmed.
How so?
Well, the regional planning body that manages homelessness funding is called a continuum of care. In Omaha, the Threshold Continuum of Care notes that their rapid rehousing program is totally backlogged.
Okay, just to clarify for everyone listening, rapid rehousing is supposed to be the mechanism that quickly gets someone off the street and into a temporarily subsidized apartment, right?
Yes, exactly. It's designed to be the quick escape hatch before the deep trauma of the streets sets in. But what used to take a month or two can now take months just to get off the wait list.
Just to get off the list.
Yeah. As one local outreach worker bluntly put it, there is absolutely nothing rapid about it anymore.
Man, so you have these absolute heroes on the ground, risking their own lives in sub-zero temperatures, fighting a systemic machine that is fundamentally jammed. Based on this, the current draft score is holding steady. We really have to balance the incredible, life-saving, ground-level outreach against an administrative system that simply cannot process the people they are rescuing.
Which brings us to the final, and undoubtedly most critical, piece of the scorecard. Pathways to permanent housing. Because everything else we've discussed, the shelters, the safe parking, the hand warmers, is just triage.
And the data here is alarming. Since 2013, Omaha's unsheltered population has grown at the fastest rate of any major U.S. city.
Let that sink in. The fastest rate of growth in the entire country.
It's wild. And while that population exploded on the streets, the actual housing options built specifically for people facing homelessness completely stagnated.
And it comes down to a severe systemic lack of funding matching the scale of the crisis. To understand why, you have to look at the federal funding math. Omaha receives roughly $4,400 per unhoused individual from federal funding streams.
Okay, $4,400.
To give you context, a city like Detroit receives about $23,000 per individual.
Wait, what? Why the huge discrepancy?
Historical funding formulas. They often favor older coastal or Rust Belt cities, leaving Midwestern cities completely starved of the capital required to build permanent supportive housing.
And when you don't have the funding to build permanent housing, you create a fatal bottleneck. We
Right.
saw the tragic outcome of that bottleneck with Paul Dewis.
Yeah, next story.
Paul went from living in a GMC van parked behind a Maple Street mechanic shop to eventually entering hospice care. Why? Because he was trapped in a literal race between the housing wait list and his feeling heart. And his heart gave out first.
It's devastating. What is deeply tragic about Paul's story is that permanent housing is the only actual cure for homelessness. Nebraska's pipeline is hopelessly clogged at the exit. People enter the system, they lose their housing, they lose their cars, they experience the compounding trauma of the streets, and they are trapped in a perpetual cycle because there are simply no permanent doors open for them to walk through.
When the pipeline to the only real cure is that fundamentally broken, and it is actively costing people their lives, this shifts the score deeply downward.
So having traced that entire journey from the loss of a home to the frozen concrete of the Keystone Trail, it is time to summarize where Nebraska stands for the final 2 minutes.
Let's recap the major strengths and weaknesses we've uncovered. The major strengths of this state are undeniably the people. The dedicated outreach workers risking their own safety in freezing temperatures to keep people alive, and the community-driven vehicle safe havens. Those local nonprofits and truck stop managers acting as a vital underground safety net.
But the massive structural weaknesses simply cannot be ignored here. We are looking at a state with the fastest growing unsheltered population among major metros. We see a total systemic failure to provide affordable housing for the very agricultural and meatpacking labor the state relies on to survive.
Right.
We see punitive towing laws that extract wealth and strip people of their final assets, and a shelter system that forces families and lifelong partners to separate just to get out of the cold.
It is time to assign the final grades for the scorecard. For housing affordability, based on the unwinnable rental market and the rural housing crisis, they get an F.
Makes sense.
For shelter access, due to the lack of inclusive beds and completely overwhelmed rural facilities.
Yeah.
D, for criminalization and enforcement, for weaponizing laws to use towing as wealth extraction. F.
For vehicle-dwelling friendliness, buoyed slightly by the resilience of nonprofits and truck stops, I'd say a C+.
And C, agreed. For outreach and social services, reflecting the heroic but totally backlogged grind teams.
B, and for pathways to permanent housing, with its fatal waitlists and severe underfunding. D.
Which brings us to the final perfectly homeless state score for Nebraska. After evaluating the lived reality across all 6 metrics, Nebraska earns a D.
A grade of D. And the reason for this failing grade is incredibly clear. The structural failures of the state, the lack of affordable housing, the punitive enforcement laws, the underfunded exit strategies, they are directly responsible for the lived realities of people like Jonathan Martin, who had to dodge police just to stand quietly behind a pet store, and Paul Dewis, who died waiting for a door to open.
It is a system that stubbornly chooses to treat the symptoms of poverty with criminalization and towing, rather than treating the root cause with housing. I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over today. How can a state's entire economy rely so heavily on the low-wage labor of migrant farmers and meatpackers, actively recruiting them to keep the agricultural sector booming, yet take absolutely zero structural responsibility for ensuring those exact same workers have a literal roof over their heads? That's the perfectly homeless state score for Nebraska. Let me know in the comments, and if there's a state you'd like to see next, tell me below.
This is a 50-state journey through how America actually treats people without housing, and every state tells a different story. If you'd like to support the project, visit the Perfectly Homeless Etsy store and pick up a PH hoodie. Every purchase helps fund future episodes and keeps these stories in front of the public. Wear the logo. Start a conversation. Because homelessness isn't someone else's problem anymore. It's happening in every state, every city, and more neighborhoods than most people realize. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next state.